very fortunate to have a very timely topic to discuss, and a topic that we have two experts on, and that's the economy and its effect on the state and on the city of Chicago. And we have two excellent speakers, and I'd like to introduce briefly our first speaker, a longtime friend of mine, Ralph Martire, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. He also serves as a regular columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, the State Journal-Register, and the Herald News on issues involving government accountability, tax, fiscal, and budget policies. And I have relied very frequently on Ralph's columns and articles to help formulate my own opinions on these important issues, because he really has an incredible amount of insight and integrity. Ralph served on the Budget Advisory Board to Governor Rod Blagojevich's transition team, where he acted as chairperson of the State Revenue Subcommittee. Ralph was the principal author of a study that the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability produced that identified revenue enhancement proposals to address the 2002 fiscal crisis in the state of Illinois. That's as opposed to the 2003, the 2004, and so on fiscal crisis. 5 of the proposals identified in that study ultimately became law, and I would venture to say that probably a few other proposals should have became law as well, and we might not be in the fix we're in. Ralph also was a key member of the research team that produced the groundbreaking State of Working Illinois report, which detailed industry, employment, wage, and benefit trends in Illinois over the last 15 years. It was a joint project of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability and Northern Illinois University. The State of Working Illinois has been featured in over 150 print and broadcast placements nationwide. Ralph graduated from the Indiana University as a Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in history and received his JD from the University of Michigan. He is married to Mary Kay Martire, who's right with us today. Please stand and take a bow. And he has 2 children, a son, Nicholas, who's age 10, and daughter, Valerie, who's age 6. Ralph, please come up. We'll have, we're going to give each of our speakers about 15 minutes for their remarks, and then we'll open it up to questions. Ralph, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Joe. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. How are you? And I appreciate you for acknowledging my wife. This is a momentous day. This is my 13th wedding anniversary. So I really do want to acknowledge my wife, and I want to thank Jay and the City Club for inviting me here. You have to understand what my day-to-day job is. I run a tax policy think tank. I have to go a lot of times into affluent communities and explain why folks there ought to be paying more in taxes to fund the education of other kids in other communities, and that's not as fun as it might sound. So I really appreciate, frankly, being invited anywhere, much less somewhere as august as this. And the topic today is sort of the be-all and end-all, isn't it? It's the economy. And I'm going to start at the federal level because I think what's going on with the bailout is very interesting. Not the $700 billion price tag, not those sort of unique investment securities that are so arcane even the folks trading in them didn't understand them, but the fact that the leaders of finance and industry turned to the government when they got in trouble. We can talk all we want about the economy, but we have to understand that the public sector needs to be vibrant and play an appropriate role, or our private economy will suffer. It's that simple. Now, Illinois state government doesn't have sort of this grandiose role that we give the feds at the end of a problem. Illinois' role is more at the beginning. Is it making the investments in our infrastructure, in our education, in our health care, in our human services to make Illinois an attractive place for a business to locate, a good place to grow our economy? I don't want to talk in platitudes about this. I think I want to drill down on specifics. First thing to know about the Illinois economy is it is big. $600 billion plus economy, $600 billion. You know, that's the 5th biggest economy of any state, but to give you a little more context, if we were an independent country, we'd have the 27th biggest economy in the world. We have a larger economy than Saudi Arabia, Ireland, Greece, Norway. That's big. But we haven't been doing so good in growing our economy. In fact, since 1980, economic growth in this big, rich state has lagged both the U.S. and the Midwest. Now, one of the major reasons for that is we are losing, we're hemorrhaging our high-paying, good-benefit manufacturing jobs. In fact, since 2000, we've lost 240,000 of those jobs. It's a huge number. 27% of these jobs have gone away. And what we've replaced them with have been low-paying service sector jobs. In fact, jobs that pay on average about 30% less than these jobs they're replacing. Now, the transition's been pretty dramatic. In 1990, manufacturing was our #1 employer. 20% of our workers, 1 out of 5, had a job in manufacturing. Manufacturing is now our 3rd biggest employer at 13%, in fact, just above retail. #1 employer in our state today, low-wage service, 30.7% of our workers. Now, that's had some consequences for people that care about public policy. Consequence #1 is in health care. What we know today is that in Illinois, over 40% of the workers, employed workers, do not have employer-provided health insurance. 4 out of 10. 57% of our Latino workers do not have employer-provided health insurance. 27% of our state's population, this big, rich state, is either uninsured or on Medicaid, over a quarter of our population. Another consequence of the shift in our private economy is in retirement security. In fact, this has been one of the biggest changes. What you see today is less than half of the workers have any retirement benefit at all provided by their employer. Less than half. So to put that together, workers are earning significantly less during their prime years. They have less access to employer-provided health insurance, meaning more of their out-of-pocket goes to health care costs. And then they have less to retire on. So every one of those factors creates costs for our public sector while hurting the revenue streams. No other way to look at that. Well, why? Why is Illinois' economy, this big, rich economy, not growing on a competitive basis with our neighboring states, with the nation? Well, despite all the silliness you read in the newspapers about us being taxed to death, that's not the answer. Believe it or not, we're a low-tax state. Overall, tax burden as a percentage of income in our state ranks 45th in the country. 5th biggest economy, 5th biggest population, 45th in tax burden. You can't be that low in the revenue you raise to finance government and expect to meet needs. Expect to invest in infrastructure. Expect to care for the vulnerable members of society. Expect to fund an education. You can't do it. Can't do it. And I want to be very clear that this tax burden metric includes everything any unit of government charges us as taxpayers, whether it's called a tax or a fee. We are a very low tax state. One thing we do know about the private economy, though, is that education today matters more than ever to economic prosperity from both a worker's perspective and from an employer's perspective. Take it from a worker's perspective. You want to be qualified for a good job? You better have more than a high school diploma. See, here's one of the changes in our private economy related to education. For the longest time, at least since the 1960s, educational attainment has been tied directly to unemployment rates. The greater your level of educational attainment, the lower your unemployment rate, except for some art history majors. Well, forget about that. The big change is the tie between education and wage. It used to be, in America, in Illinois, you could graduate high school and go get you a good job. You could get you a job that had put a car or two in the garage and a kid or two through college. That day is over. Since 1980, the only group of workers in our entire state that have seen their incomes grow at a rate greater than inflation have some college degree. Could be an associate's degree. Doesn't need to be a 4-year degree. But they absolutely need to have credentialed themselves. Flip that to an employer's perspective. If you run a high-end facility, you need a highly skilled workforce. No question. You don't want to locate your business in a state that's not investing fundamentally what it needs to invest in K-12 education and on. You want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars training workers, not just in hard skills, soft skills. You want people that are going to show up for their jobs on time, be reliable, and education proxies for all those things. So now that we know how much education matters to driving our private economy, what are we doing as far as funding education in Illinois? We're dropping the ball. First, higher ed. Our state government transfers into higher ed. This is everything from community colleges on up through university systems, have dropped every year after adjusting for inflation since Governor Blagojevich has been in office. Every single year. Some years by $200–300 million. What are we telling business there? We telling them we're going to invest in our workforce? Well, then there's K-12 education. What are we doing there? This may be the single most misunderstood aspect of really important public policy in our entire state. We have something called the foundation system of funding schools. So we start out with, as the name would imply, a foundation level, a basic building block per kid that's supposed to be tied to academic costs. And on top of this foundation, we layer other elements of school funding. So the foundation level doesn't include special ed, it doesn't include transportation, it doesn't include poverty. It's really a foundation. Now, our foundation level is, last year anyway, was $5,700 per child. You know what that's based on? Nothing. It's a made-up number. It's sort of what the state government thinks it could afford per kid. Now, a few years back, Governor Ryan, well, before he was convicted, Governor Ryan thought that nothing was probably not the strongest basis for education funding. So he appointed EFAB, the Education Funding Advisory Board. Their job was simple. Take this foundation level and tie it to something meaningful. All right. The meaningful standard they chose is what would it cost per child to buy a sufficient quality level of teachers and academic programs so that we could expect 2/3 of our non-at-risk kids to actually pass the state standardized tests. We're not there right now. That standard's pretty tight. First of all, it's 2/3 of the kids, right? It's not all the kids passing tests. We have that federal law, what's it called, No Child's Behind His Left or something like that, in NCLB. To be very clear, it's not enough to get to NCLB. Number two, it's not even 2/3 of all kids. It's based on 2/3 of non-at-risk children. Now, it's more expensive to educate an at-risk child who comes from concentrated poverty, special needs, et cetera. So based on this tight, narrow standard, our foundation level today ought to be $7,100 per kid. It's $57,000. That $1,400 difference in the basic academic instructional expense would cost roughly $2 billion in new money in the education system to fund. We are $2 billion short of a barely adequate education if you consider adequate getting 2/3 of our kids passing tests. It's not the only place our educational system falls a little short. You know, 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education, Illinois schools are still very much separate. We have the third most segregated state in the nation by race when it comes to education. We have about 82% of our black children attending virtually all black schools, and we have about 90% of our white kids in virtually all white schools. And we're not just still separate, we're still unequal. The African American school districts start off with about $1,200 less per child to spend on education than their white peers. If education matters more than ever in the economy, what we've done is systemically, for decades, denied economic opportunity to children of color by the way we fund schools. And you know what? It's not just my opinion. It's shown in the data. Since 1990, the wage gap between whites and blacks in Illinois has gotten worse by 120%. Well, those kids just aren't competitive with their white peers when they come out of their underfunded, inadequate schools. But could we really expect this added investment to create greater academic achievement? This $2 billion. I mean, how many times have you heard money doesn't matter in education? I've heard that a lot. I've heard it mostly when I've been in affluent communities that have world-class educations and small class sizes and rich programs and highly qualified teachers. But I've heard it. Well, you know, we studied school districts in Illinois. And we wanted to control for that one wild card, and I'm sure you've heard about this wild card, family environment. Doesn't matter how much you spend on a kid's education, it's about their family environment. If they got a two-parent family and education's reinforced in home, those kids are going to do well, and the other kids are going to struggle. So we looked at those kids, the kids who have good families. We looked at every school district in Illinois that had low poverty, 3 to 8%. 77 of those school districts exist. You know what we found out? That at $5,000 per kid in instructional expense, even with these good families, half of those school districts were underperforming expectations, half were above. In fact, no correlation between the investment and academic outcomes. None. Until you moved up from 5,000 to 7,000. When you make that increase, every school district moved up to at or above expectations in academic performance. Even with family involvement, you have to make a minimum investment in quality education to be sure that education's going to take hold. So why isn't Illinois funding education adequately? Do we have bad priorities at the state? We running away from this problem? Guess what the number one budget item is in our state budget in Illinois? Number one, education. 33% of our budget. Take higher ed through K through 12, 33% of our state's budget today goes to education. Number two, healthcare. Healthcare. Remember, 40% of our workers do not have employer-provided health insurance. 27% of our state's population is uninsured or on Medicaid. Certainly devoting 30% of our public resources to health care funding sounds rational. Number three, human services. You know, that wasteful government stuff, taking care of the homeless, developmentally disabled adults, abused and neglected children, homebound seniors, that stuff. That's about 18.5% of our budget. In fact, education, health, and human services, 83, 84% of our budget. Throw in public safety, 90% of the budget. Throw in our pension, 94, 95% of the budget. Where's the bad priority? The truth of the matter is our tax system is not designed to meet the needs of the state of Illinois on the front end. So we strangle things like education, healthcare, and human services. We underfund them. And on the back end, we see our economy hurt and declining vis-a-vis our Midwestern peers and the nation. And we have a lower tax burden than them. So for Illinois to move forward, we just have to be honest about the scope of our problems. I'm not here to tell you there's no waste, fraud, and abuse in public spending. Yeah, there is. It's not material. The material problem is we have a tax and revenue system designed for a 1900s economy. We can't balance our budget. We can't invest in education. We can't do what it takes to be a competitive state in a global economy with our current revenue system. It's that simple. We need a tax reform that'll generate the money we need to invest in schools, infrastructure, healthcare, caring for the vulnerable members of our society. And we need to do that in a way that tracks growth in the modern economy. And here's the kicker to me. We could actually solve all the state's financial problems, balance our budgets, invest more in education, grow our economy, have a capital program, have a rational transit all this stuff for a cost of about $6 billion. $6 billion. That's a big number. We have a $600 billion economy. It's 1% of our economy. 1%. We need to raise 1% of our economy in taxes and invest it in those basic things government has to do right for the private sector to thrive. And we can't have that discussion. It's outrageous. Illinois can and should do better. And the only thing that's stopping us is political will. I really appreciate being invited here. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And now we're going to hear from a good friend of mine, someone I served with in my first 16 years on a city council. I was elected in 1991, and Burton Natarus had already been on the city council for 20 years. So I was able to learn a lot from him, gain a lot of wisdom and experience based on his long tenure in the city council. Burton Natarus was elected by the people of 42nd Ward to serve as their representative for 9 consecutive terms. During his long career in public service, Burton Natarus worked with Chicago's mayors to transform Chicago's downtown, the area that he represented, into the most residentially viable and commercially successful area in the city, while earning a reputation as someone who was unafraid of tackling tough issues. He was recognized as one of the city council's most creative and prolific legislators, and Alderman Natarus pioneered the city's first handgun legislation in the early 1970s, and more recently it introduced an ordinance to improve maternity leave benefits for new parents employed by the city of Chicago. Now, long known for skillfully balancing the divergent interests of his diverse community, Burt was on the cutting edge of the city's efforts to encourage greening and balanced growth, not only in the downtown area, but throughout the city of Chicago. He applied a similar out-of-the-box strategy to improve education, a top priority in his tenure as alderman, and he passed an ordinance providing incentives to developers who contribute to an infrastructure improvement fund for Chicago public schools. This program promises to generate significant funds for school improvements throughout the city, including the rehabilitation of Ogden School. Burt received his JD from the University of Wisconsin and served as a captain and trained parachutist in the U.S. Army Reserves. A modern-day Renaissance man, he is a distinguished member of the International Society of Poets, a whitewater rafting enthusiast. One of the most famous photos of Burt is there with his raft on the, Colorado River, Burt? And, okay. Yeah, he's a cinemaphile. He was the city council's resident comedian, and he is a proud grandfather of 2 grandchildren and the guardian of a cantankerous cat. Ladies and gentlemen, Burt Natarus.
I'd like to introduce my son, Michael. And I regret I cried for 3 days, but Julian died. Julian's the cat. I want to commend you. Where did he go? Did he leave? Oh, Ralph, I'm sorry. I'm 75. I want to commend you. I have a little different approach, and I think some of you are going to walk out because it's quite boring. I wrote a paper, if you want to read it, and if you don't like it, you can turn it over for scratch paper. Everything you say is true. So I'd like to read this, if I can, if you don't mind. And if it gets boring, do walk out. My dear friends, Chicagoans, and countrymen, lend me your ears. I am not here to bury or banish our republic, but I am here to praise it. Let us remember, though, we are a democracy. The complete democratic process is limited as we elect people to make our decisions, and hence we are a very complicated, sophisticated form of government called a republic. Unlike other countries who elect majority political parties who assume the responsibility of running the government, we elect, our founding fathers founded a republic which satisfied the desires and needs of not necessarily the majority of the populace. At Independence Hall, there were always crowds of people who were demonstrating and remembering this was the time of the French Revolution. Inside, a select few wrote a Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, and later a much debated and deliberated and voted by state convention a constitution. It was a constitution which the president was elected by the Senate and later the Electoral College. It's very important to watch this election and make certain, I hope, that whoever receives the majority vote also is elected by the Electoral College. If not, I have my fears. Sam Adams did not have to pay taxes for his whiskey to the crown, and Americans could cross the Appalachian Mountains, which they were forbidden to do, to garner furs and sell whiskey in Kentucky and Tennessee, known as the Midwest. David McCullough wrote a wonderful explanation in his book about John Adams, and this was put on TV. The discussion between Thomas Jefferson later and John Quincy Adams about John Quincy Adams complaining that he did not have enough taxes for revenue to build roads and maintain the ports and other various physical facilities. The desire, the country was basically run and operated by state conventions, by the states, and it was not until the Civil War and the enactment of the federal income tax that the national government came into its own. So there we are today, something at what appears to be an uncontrollable downward cycle. To our advantage, however, the economic situation today is different from what it was in 1929. I like to read to you what Roosevelt said. This book was written in 1933. The issue of government has always been whether individual men and women will have to serve some system of government or economics, or whether the system of government and economics exists to serve individual men and women. I ask you today, who is it serving? Men and women or businesses? This book was written by Franklin Roosevelt, in which he called a system a call to arms. In 1929, unlike today, there was nothing. So FDR closed the banks, and he announced the New Deal. The New Deal was a call to arms. And I know there are people in this room who hate Roosevelt. They hate FDR. They thought he was a socialist. They thought he was a communist for the things that he did. But you know, I experienced that Depression when I was a little boy. And we were living in Milwaukee on 35th and Lisbon. And my dad, David, and Nettie, my mom, we would walk down the street every day to the Parkway Theater and pick up a bag of groceries. There were no payments. There was no divvy. There were no dollars. We picked up a bag of groceries for the day. Today, however, we are throwing money in all kinds of directions. During the Depression of the 30s, we became very, very close to losing this country. If you've read any of the stories, you know that there were marches on Washington, torchlight parades, veterans, laborers. There was violence. Roosevelt created a number of authoritative agencies to assist the economy. SEC, CAB, Social Security, NLRB, FTC, and the ICC was already existed. That was the one that regulated railroads, and that was created in the 1900s. The CCC was created, which created a system of maintaining parks and spaces. There was a TVA, which many people believed was communistic and socialistic, that set up waterways, TV dams and waterways in Kentucky and Tennessee. And finally, they created what they call a WPA. They put people to work on the streets, on the railroads, on the roadways. In fact, there are many, many miles of what we call WPA streets here in Chicago still remaining. That's how we create, that was the result of Roosevelt's work. Robert Moses did an awful lot of work in New York, and people criticized him. He was somewhat of a dictatorial individual, but many of the, very, very highly criticized, but many of the parks and many of the physical activities and institutions in New York were created. I wrote a paper about this in the Chicago Tribune in 1996, and this paper that I have here is a critique. This helped, but not completely. It was until this didn't help completely, but it wasn't until the World War started to heat up that Roosevelt was able to build up the economy slowly. In fact, World War II helped our economy in the sense that many, many people who built factories and built businesses during World War II were able to survive after World War II and carry on their businesses. Many of the businesses today started as a result of wartime activities. And that's how we climbed out of the abyss. But I must say this about that early depression. One of the things you'll find out in all of these downward cycles and all of these depressions, there's always somebody that's going to be wealthy. Somehow or other, there are people who survive and are wealthy. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote a number of books about this. Louis Mayer, Walt Disney, Sam Goldwyn started the movie industry originally in Chicago, and then they went out west because of the lighting and the views out there, and set up the movie industry. Then, of course, you had John Steinbeck, who wrote The Grapes of Wrath. Remember that movie with Henry Fonda, Jane Darnell, Walter Brennan, about coming out of the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma, and trying to go to California. And when they reached California, there were actual blockades built by Americans to keep the people out. And then, of course, we had a very famous case called United States versus Hurtado, in which the Supreme Court of the United States announced, I'm over time. I'm trying to read fast. announced the fact that it's the right of every American to move around the country. Just imagine that. You know, during that period of time, there were many people who were disillusioned. Many intellectuals held discussions. There were feelers out to socialist countries, Russia, Sweden, Norway, and they were actually carrying on discussions about changing the nature of the United States. Nothing really took place, but all of those people were punished, weren't they, later, after World War II, when they were discovering, when Joe McCarthy discovered these conversations and brought them in front of hearings. They called the McCarthy hearings, which fortunately really proved to be nothing, because all these people were thinking in very, very critical times. Well, FDR was a great wartime leader, wasn't he? But he certainly wasn't kind to the Jews. When the St. Louis came to the shores of the United States, the Jewish people were not allowed to come into the United States. They went to Cuba, they were turned down there, and they went back to Holland, and most of them were killed. And so Hitler said, well, no one cares about the Jews, let the Holocaust begin. Whether you agreed with Roosevelt and his faults or not, he did do one thing. He saved the capitalistic system for the United States. His actions saved the capitalistic system. So here we are, God bless, save our republic, and what must we do to save it? Did you all see the opening of the Olympics? Wasn't that beautiful, all those dancers synchronized? How did you like the following picture in the New York Times of all of these soldiers in green at Port Arms? What did that tell you? We're dealing with a very, very highly sophisticated, synchronized, totalitarian machine. And I'm talking about the Far East. These people don't have to have deliberations in the Congress of the United States. These people aren't going to have plenary sessions to discuss anything. When they make a decision, they move. And we have much to fear about that. And we have much to fear from other systems in the Far East and in the Near East. And what is happening with these systems? Well, these systems seem to be gathering up money. The United States, of course, you know, is borrowing millions and millions of dollars every day from the Chinese. Did I frighten you, ma'am? I know you gotta go. Well, I'm almost done. Meanwhile, we've lost millions in jobs. We've lost millions of dollars in homes. And meanwhile, billions of dollars are being invested in Dubai. You know, we support it. They always like to blast the United States. They always want to criticize the United States. And yet, when I look around Chicago, I see so many foreign students coming here to be educated, coming here to our university. After World War II, who was it that saved Europe? You have to understand that when you go out and you save these countries, when you help them monetarily, they're not necessarily going to thank you for it. Some of them think they have it coming. So what do we really have to do, it seems to me? I think we have to throw our money in the right places. Number one, I think we should create the WPA. I think we ought to throw money at the people. I think we ought to create jobs. There's no reason why we can't have people out there on the street doing our infrastructure, building our transportation systems, building our bridges, repairing our highways. Now, how do you do it? Well, we would have to have revenue sharing. And of course, many people who are critical of the way the government of Illinois is being run may not want revenue sharing given to the state of Illinois, but we have no other choice. We should have revenue sharing in the city of Chicago. I went through that in 1986. All of a sudden, during the Washington administration, they pulled revenue sharing out. Washington didn't know what to do but raise property taxes. They came in with a $72 billion raise. We were able to negotiate it down to 23, and in that primary election, I almost lost the election. I had 8 people running against me, and it was the most terrifying experience I ever had. In fact, it was the only time that I ever had, I was ever driven home in a police car. I don't know what it is about our national government. When they want to do something, they certainly do. When Congress wanted to build a subway system, they certainly did it. I remember in the 80s going to Washington, traveling around in a cab with a guy by the name of Fan Steele, and they were building the Washington subway just like that. I think we have to engage in more public-private partnerships. I know you're very critical of that, but we have to obtain money somewhere. There's no reason why, if we have open and complete transparency, we can't make these public partnerships work. With regard to taxes here in Chicago, the key is the property tax. Why is the property tax important to Chicago and cities? It's because once the property tax is levied and is put on the rolls, it does not go down to Springfield. Ms. Pappas then issues the checks to the various agencies like the Park District, the Board of Education, and the City of Chicago. We have to figure out a way of broadening this base, and that is we've got to urge the aldermen not to be so conservative with regard to building. They've got to do something about encouraging building even in this kind of atmosphere, even if it means more low-rise construction, so that if we don't raise the rate, at least we can broaden the base. I thoroughly agree that we have to raise the state income tax. It is absolutely essential that we do so. Now remember 2 things. One, the state income tax, and it's not told to people, the state income tax is deductible from the federal. Remember one thing about the property tax. The property tax is deductible from the state, and the property tax is deductible from the federal. Now, not a lot of people know this, but I think if this, in an education program, if this was brought out to people, maybe they wouldn't be so reluctant to support an increase in taxes. The Board of Education, the city, the Park District, Water Reclamation District depend primarily upon the property tax for its budget. In my estimation, the biggest problem that we have in the state of Illinois is the cleavage between the city of Chicago and downstate. Downstate is the biggest factor in supporting low taxes. They want the people in Chicago to pay. They like to come here and entertain themselves and enjoy themselves, but when you come up for a vote, you ask Emil Jones and you ask Madigan what happens when it comes to downstate. And finally, my last proposal is I think we have to have compulsory government service. Everyone at the age of 18, men and women, go to work for the government for 3 years. We tax the money back, wages. They learn all about the government. They become educated. They learn a trade. and then they go out into work. They do it in Europe, they do it in Israel, and it does work. Finally, let me say this. We better get hip to what the Near East is all about. I want to tell you just one illustration. In the late 50s, in Iran, there was a democracy under a prime minister by the name of Mossadegh. The United States went in there and didn't like him. And what did they do? They put in the Shah. Carter came along and didn't like the Shah. So he removed the Shah, and within 10 days, the Ayatollah Khomeini came in, and now we have the clerics running Iran. Afghanistan. Just remember, Afghanistan has always been a problem. You have to understand that the Russians are there, the Chinese are there. It's Russian foreign policy to try to reach the sea. And remember the story of Gunga Din. Remember Gunga Din? Remember the poem by Rudyard Kipling? The British were coming in. Bagpipes were ringing. The elephants were coming. And don't you remember the movie with Franchot Tone, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and Cary Grant? And they were in the room, and Gunga Din climbs to the tower and blows the bugle and saves the British Army. God bless America. I thought that was a very polite clap for a boring speech.
Thank you both to Bert and Ralph. As is customary here, we have some time for some questions. We have cards on the table. Do we not, Jay? Hand them up to the moderator, and I will ask, and while you're gathering them, I have a question for both the panelists, and that is, both of you have advocated an increase in the state property tax, and I know, no? All right. I mean, I'm sorry, income tax. I misspoke. The income tax. And in light of the current economic circumstances, both from a political point of view as well as an economic point of view, is it advisable to increase the state income tax during a time of economic recession?
I'll give my opinion on that. The first opinion I have is it's never a good time politically to increase taxes. Who has heard of that good time? When is it a rousing good time for an elected official to go to their constituent and say, you need to pony more out of your pocket to support this government?
It was a better time a few years ago.
Well, but when we had the better time, we didn't do it.
Right.
We cut taxes. So the bottom line is, it's never a good time politically, but it's absolutely an appropriate time economically right now. Because what we've advocated at my organization isn't a simple tax increase, it's a major tax reform. It would include a number of components. Not only would we increase the state's income tax, we would expand the state sales tax base to include consumer services. We would reduce the sales tax rate. We would provide targeted tax relief to low and middle income families. We'd provide tax relief in property taxes to everybody, businesses and homeowners. And net, we'd have a fairer, more stable, more responsive system that could actually fund government, and we would shift tax burden from low and middle income families who see their annual take-home pay decrease every year after inflation to more affluent families who'd be, in other words, paying taxes from their growing wealth, as opposed to low and middle income folks who are currently paying taxes from their growing poverty. So we suggest a number of reforms that would modernize the system and allow the state to make appropriate investments on the front end.
Well, I don't have any problem with that, but I think Chicago is overtaxed. I think a lot of these special taxes that only apply to Chicago should be removed. And I also still think we ought to have gambling.
All right, now we're going to take some questions from the audience here. This is from Peter Scozzi from the Metropolitan Planning Council. Population increase equals more tax revenue. What can or should government do to get more people in the city and in the state?
You know, you're not going to attract people to the state if your economy is falling behind the rest of the Midwest and the nation. Now, let's just start there, right? And we have an economy that, for 20 years, I mean, we're talking about economics today in the scope of a national meltdown. But you got to understand the 20-year trend in Illinois is down. So we have to turn that around, Peter, and actually do, from a public sector standpoint, those things that attract folks in. Now, before I took my job running a tax and economic policy think tank, I was a business lawyer representing Fortune 5 companies and banks. And I got to tell you, one thing businesses look at is what's available in the community. Does it have not just good infrastructure from a transit standpoint, how about open space? How about parks? What's the quality of the education? Is it a community that my executives and my workers are going to be happy to live in? Well, if you're not making investments, look what we're doing with our public parks. I mean, everything we can do to discourage businesses from moving to our state, big picture, we've been doing for a long time. So in my mind, it goes back to having government appropriately funded on the front end so the investments are made and business has some confidence that your state is going to stay on course and do what it takes to create a community that they want to exist in.
Well, you know, what bothers me the more, you come into Chicago and you see a beautiful, beautiful site with all of the high-rise buildings. And then, let me ask you this, have you ever gone down the Eisenhower? You know, the Eisenhower looks the same as when the night, God forbid, when Martin Luther King died. There's nothing being built on the west side. And it seems to me that with the housing fund that's being developed through the contributions of developers who built high-rise buildings, that money should start being spent for low-income housing or middle-income housing, low-level housing. And if you want, I wouldn't like to say this to too many of them. The most conservative group in the city of Chicago are the aldermen. When you go into an alderman's ward, you have to be very careful to fit the formula. And I think we've got to sit down with the aldermen and say, listen, you got to get pro-development. We got to get stores out there. There's a guy by the name of Primo who would love to build on the west side. And the other thing that we have to do is we got to start building the west side to broaden the tax base.
Alderman Moore, is that the first time you've been called conservative?
One of the first.
I'm not here to call anybody names. I'm just talking about an attitude.
Well, we have a question from an old friend, Chester Krupolowski, who used to work at the Department of Transportation. What are your thoughts on the proposed Olympics in Chicago and the impacts it could have on our local economy?
Well, I think the Olympics is a good idea. And I tell you what, I hope it doesn't end up like we did many years ago when another mayor supported the World's Fair. It failed. And I know this is a top priority of Mayor Daley, but in order to make this work, we've got to be able to show the public that after the Olympics leaves, there are some positive programs or some positive things that have been done that the city can use again. And I'm particularly thinking in terms of housing.
I think it has to lead to sustainable economic development. So, I mean, of course, it would be a good idea to host a major international event like that, bring tourists from around the world in, have them spend their money at our hotels and eat at our restaurants, et cetera. That's all good. But you have to be very careful where you build out facilities to house the Olympics, what communities are going to benefit from that growth. Because, you know, we have seen that a lot of times maybe the communities that need some investment in them economically the most don't get it. And I would like to see that the build out happens in such a way that it doesn't just benefit those that live in affluent zip codes, but that some sustainable economic growth happens in those in other zip codes.
There's another thing. I'm going to drop in another bug here. The thing that really bugs me to no end is the inability to build a transportation system in this town. You know, one of the big arguments I had with, God bless him, really, God bless him, I had a big argument with my committeeman and over this. We had a chance to have a circulator, you know. And I wanted the circulator to go down Water Street before the Calatrava was there and before any one of those buildings was built. And all they had to do was build a metal bridge, and we could have had a train going to Navy Pier. My committeeman said, well, everybody can drive a car. Well, you know, the trouble is the public itself is fickle about a lot of problems. Now, in the new zoning ordinance, we have created transportation districts. And it seems to me we've got, the national government, the ICC, has got to get the railroads off the dime. The railroads have to be partners in this. There's no reason why we can't build a comprehensive transportation system on the existing railroad tracks in this town. And the railroads have to be partners and they have to contribute. But they don't want to do it. They want to be, they're selfish, and they want to engage in freight.
Question from Joyce Saxon, City Club board member. This is directed to Ralph, but Bert, you can weigh in as well. Ralph, can we attract new businesses to Illinois if we increase the tax burden?
Yeah, I think we absolutely can, and I think we have to, because they care a lot more about the investments we make with that money than the tax burden per se. And let's just look at the existing situation. The existing situation is we have one of the lowest tax burdens in the entire nation and have had that status for decades.
Steve, nice seeing you.
And for decades, our economy has fallen behind the rest of the Midwest and the nation in economic growth. So low tax burden alone is no sine qua non for attracting in business. I think second, you know, business right now is doubly leery of locating in our great state because our tax system is so messed up. At some point, they know the state's going to have to raise more revenue, and they're worried that that revenue gun is going to be pointed at the business community because businesses don't vote, right? They can lobby, but they don't vote. So when you have an unstable revenue environment, businesses are cautious about locating in your state. They want some certainty as they make their projections going forward. Get back to the proposals that my organization has supported and that are actually in the legislature. You know, two things would happen. And number one, after they become law, we would remain one of the 10 lowest taxing states in the nation. We stay in the bottom 10. We go from 45th to 41st. We lose none of our competitiveness. Number two, business tax burden would go down by about $400 million a year, because while the corporate profit tax rate would go up, they would share in the property tax relief. The net would be overall tax burden for businesses goes down, and look at what goes down. Property tax burden. Read that as fixed cost. Businesses don't like fixed costs. Shifting their burden to their variable cost, their profit tax, is a much better way to tax businesses. So, you know, a willy-nilly goofy tax increase, and what comes to mind is the gross receipts tax the governor offered up a couple of years ago, would be bad policy. My organization testified against that. I testified against that. It was bad tax policy. What we need is a meaningful tax reform that allows us to make the investments in infrastructure that will attract business in here long term, and we need to do it sooner rather than later.
There's
Bert?
another aspect of this. This national administration has got to recognize the rights of labor. Maybe people wouldn't come here then if they were being paid a decent wage. Our own businessmen go to foreign countries in order to make more money, and they don't necessarily help the United States.
Well, we think we've run out of time, but really thank both of you, both Ralph Martire and Bert Natarus.